Hello, I'm Dr. Annalene Weston, dental legal consultant at Dental Protection. Welcome to RiskBites, a series of podcasts created specifically for dental practitioners in Australia. RiskBites looks at the key dental legal risks and issues affecting dental practitioners across Australia and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to steer clear of them, leaving you free to provide safe and high-quality dental care for your patients. In this edition, I'm joined by my colleague Kristin to talk through some of the main points of interest from our recent Sliding Doors webinar, Who's Driving the Bus?, where our case managers Kristin and Anita delved into a number of issues that practitioners have experienced when there was uncertainty surrounding independent practice and fundamentally what this can mean for practitioners and their patients who share patient care.
Thanks, Annalene. Now, as you know, the Sliding Doors series was intended to look at key issues for my division, being that of dental therapists, dental hygienists, and oral health therapists. However, the issues of navigating shared patient care has relevance for all divisions, as we consider the question of who is driving the bus. Is it me as the OHT? Is it my principal dentist? Is it the specialist that the patient's been referred to? Or maybe it's even the practice owner or the patient. I think, though, that the reason this question sits very firmly in my mind is as a therapist hygienist, as you know, as a division, we receive the highest proportion of complaints relating to scope. And the basis of what we're talking through today could be seen to link very closely with the evolution of our scope of practice.
Agreed. And there are many practitioners, both within your division and others, that contact Dental Protection to talk through their understanding of scope. So it's very wide and varied between practitioners, and consequently, it can cause some confusion.
That's right. And as I mentioned before, I really do think that some of this confusion can be tied back to the evolution of OHPs. I don't want to get sidetracked by all the intricacies of this, though I really do think that the history of dental therapy as such in Australia is a really interesting place to start. If we consider what could be thought of as a relative short history, dental therapy has undergone significant change in that time, even in the time since I graduated, which of course was very recently.
Absolutely.
So to provide some context, the first dental therapy schools were established in Australia in Tassie and South Australia back in 1966 and 67 to assist in the treatment of children in the public sector. Now, at the time, it was a requirement of that model of care that therapists provided their treatment under the general supervision and or prescription of a dentist. This remained the general lie of the land for some time until the introduction of the hygiene stream within Australia, and then with auxiliaries then being able to move into the private practice around 2000. Noting, of course, that in Western Australia, they'd been therapists in private practice for some time since 1971, with the distinction of training between dental therapists and school dental therapists. Now, the really big changes then came around after the formation of AHPRA.
Yeah, and I remember those changes coming through actually, because it was around this time, I believe, that the prescribed list of duties were repealed.
That's right. So I remember when I graduated, I was provided with a paper copy of pages from the Dental Practitioners Registration Regulation 2001, what a mouthful, in Queensland, which had a very black and white list of each of the duties that I was allowed to perform for each of my roles, being therapy and hygiene.
Yeah, and I know that when practitioners call through to talk through their scope issues, the removal of these formalised lists of duties has seemed to leave some people feeling a little bit unsure about where the edges are.
Yeah, I totally agree. As now it's up to the individual practitioner's responsibility to know and determine their own scope, which we'll go into more detail about very soon. So the Scope of Practice Registration Standard was introduced in 2014, and it outlined that a team approach between dental practitioners was encouraged so that patients were assured of receiving the most appropriate treatment from the dental practitioner who was most appropriate to provide it. However, this registration standard did not allow hygienists, therapists, or OHTs to practice as independent practitioners, and they were only able to work within a structured professional relationship with the dentist. This then further evolved again in 2020 with us entering the era of independent practice. The current Scope of Practice guidelines builds on our code of conduct and still encourages practitioners to work together as a cohesive dental team to provide the highest standard of care where each patient receives the most appropriate treatment from the most suitable practitioner.
Sounds very familiar, Kristin.
It does indeed. And the code still recognises that to do this, it's imperative that practitioners know their scope of practice and highlights that practitioners can only perform treatments that they've been educated and trained in and that you're competent in, and referring when appropriate.
So before we go into the obvious question about determining one's scope, have these changes made significant difference to us as practitioners, do you think? I mean, what was the purpose of the shift?
I think what changes this has actually made to us in our day-to-day working lives is entirely dependent on the individual practitioner. When we look at locations of dentists and allied health professionals, the majority of these are employed and work in metropolitan private practices. And with that in mind, it's quite possible that these dental health practitioners have continued to work in a collaborative team environment, as they previously always had within their structured professional relationship. And the ability to work as an independent practitioner may have had minimal impact. However, the area that was a high priority amongst the considerations to the government and public health service providers looking into these changes was the hope to see a positive impact on access for specific groups of patients, enabling better health outcomes for populations that carry greater disease burden, such as rural and regional communities, as well as aged healthcare.
That was completely understandable, I think, and obviously a high priority to enable better access for those most in need. So now, whether these changes in 2020 have made a significant impact to individual practitioners, one repeated issue we see at Dental Protection, and it was addressed in the webinar, of course, is no matter where we practice, the type or location, we need to be mindful to ensure that everyone's on the same page and who's responsible for what. And that's what we're here to talk about today, really, isn't it, Kristin? Who's actually driving the bus? As no one wants to experience, a moment where we in fact realise that no one is driving.
That's entirely right. That's certainly something that I wouldn't want to experience either. During the webinar, we took the time to look into this area by stepping through a number of cases where, unfortunately, there had been some confusion and sadly things had fallen through the cracks, resulting in a poor outcome for a patient. And unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go through all of the cases we discussed today. So if you'd like to have a look at all of the different situations, we'd recommend that you log on to Prism to access the webinar recording. But for today, I thought we'd just pick one of the cases to look through the lens of independent practice and scope of practice.
Yeah, that's great, Kristin. And this one's a cracker. So do you want to start off with the background?
Yes. So this particular case relates to orthodontic treatment and specifically aligner treatment. The background was as follows. Mr. B attended his local general dental practice regularly for his checkups and cleans, and he generally saw Mrs. A for his hygiene appointment, who was an OHT. And this included a comprehensive examination with Dr. X at the same time. Now, over the years, Mr. B decided he wanted to improve the aesthetics of some relapsed orthodontic treatment, and he spoke to Mrs. B about his concerns during his regular clean. Mrs. A assisted with the collection of the required diagnostic material, and this was sent off digitally to an aligner company for them to treatment plan an expected result, all neatly distilled into an AI-generated overview. During this time, Dr. X moved on from the practice. However, Dr. Y began not long after. Mr. B's aligner treatment plan was returned, and he reviewed and discussed the details with the patient coordinator in the front office. Mr. B was happy with the simulated plan that day and approved and embarked on his aligner journey not long after. Mr. B continued with his regular cleaning appointments at the practice during his aligner treatment, ensuring good oral hygiene, and he generally saw Mrs. A for this aligner issuing appointments. Unfortunately, midway through the treatment, Dr. Y left the practice, and there was some delay before Dr. Z then came on board. This wasn't of great concern to Mr. B, however, as Mrs. A was continuing to keep things moving for him, so the change didn't really seem to impact him much at all. Unfortunately, as he neared the end of his aligner treatment, Mr. B began to have concerns on what was potentially going to be the final position of his teeth. And so he spoke to Dr. Z about these concerns at his regular checkup appointment, which he had helpfully scheduled in advance. During this appointment, Dr. Z advised him that they were actually not across the particulars of the aligner therapy, which was surprising to Mr. B. And this concern was further compounded when Dr. Z advised that aligner therapy was not something that they had trained in and so was not actually in their scope of practice, and he didn't offer this type of treatment to his patients, so he couldn't offer any advice. Understandably, Mr. B was quite upset about this development and on returning home undertook some research of his own online, falling down the rabbit hole of information on aligner treatment and then disturbingly discovering something called scope of practice, which Dr. Z had mentioned. After Mr. B's investigations, he formed the view that, in fact, Mrs. A had been providing his orthodontic treatment independently, rather than in a supportive role to doctors X, Y, and Z. Horrified by this potential revelation, Mr. B contacted AHPRA immediately via the online option to notify them of his concerns on what he was very worried was potentially inappropriate orthodontic treatment he'd been receiving.
Okay, so it's quite an interesting scenario. And I remember this case, Kristin. And when I watched the webinar, you gave the practitioners listening some time to consider the question of who was actually driving the bus in this situation. Was it Mrs. A, the OHT? Was it doctors X, Y, and Z? Was it the patient coordinator? Or maybe it was Mr. B in charge of his own treatment? Or perhaps it was actually the aligner company that was driving the bus?
Yes, it's really an interesting consideration when we look at all of the moving parts of who contributes to patients' treatment, especially these days with third-party planning, patients' increased involvement, and their autonomy in their own treatment, as well as health practitioners and the roles of the support staff who assist us. What are your thoughts? Do you have any hunches on who you think might have been driving the bus, Annalene?
Well, I do, in fact, Kristin, though I think I might be at a bit of an unfair advantage here. So what I think is more important is to step through what the dental board's position was, as ultimately that's what we all want to know, isn't it?
Yes, that's really the bottom line. So now, as you may have expected, after Mr. B contacted AHPRA regarding his concerns, a notification to Mrs. A quickly followed, asking for a response to the complaint that Mrs. A was providing orthodontic treatment independently and seeking clarification around the particulars of her scope of practice and the particulars of the treatments that she was providing as a whole to her patients. Mrs. A contacted Dental Protection to assist in providing a comprehensive response to the notification, stepping through the practice model and her understanding of her scope of practice based on her training and all the additional orthodontic and sequential aligner CPD that she had undertaken. Now, unfortunately, on review of Mrs. A's response, there was an even quicker response back from AHPRA as the board proposed to take immediate action. And for those of you who haven't experienced an AHPRA notification, you may be aware that the primary purpose of AHPRA is to protect the public. So with this in mind, if the board determines that there's a significant enough risk, they can actually restrict a health practitioner's ability to practice if they believe it's necessary to protect the public. So generally, in most cases, practitioners actually continue to practice through the course of a notification, as it can be quite a lengthy process and take a long time to reach an outcome. However, in certain specific situations, such as this one, the board determined that this would not be appropriate. Rather, they were concerned that if Mrs. A continued to practice as they had suspected, there was a real risk to patients, and consequently they followed the path of immediate action to hold a big red stop sign while they investigated further. So what you can likely guess in this situation was that on review, AHPRA had determined from the initial information that Mrs. A was driving the bus on this occasion, providing orthodontic treatment independently, and shouldn't have been. They had significant concerns on the potential for harm to patients and took steps to ensure that Mrs. A ceased practicing before they investigated further, with a final determination to be made at the completion of their investigation. Unfortunately, Mr. B was unable to complete his aligner therapy at the practice and understandably moved to a new practice to complete his treatment, as well as his general care on receipt of a full refund and his records.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate outcome for everyone involved, isn't it? So let's have a look at the questions everyone's likely thinking. What went wrong? And how can I stop this from happening to me?
So yes, there's obviously a number of aspects to consider, and we thought it'd be helpful to discuss some of these considerations or the tools that we ought to have in our toolbox. So in each of the situations that we discussed in the webinar, there were a number of things that contributed to patients and practitioners ultimately coming unstuck. So let's start at the very beginning with the Code of Conduct. As you know, it underpins our professional conduct in all aspects, and it outlines a clear expectation that we work as a team. The code recognises that comprehensive dental care requires an organised and planned approach to patient treatment care. So we actually need to think about what we're doing. And further, that by respecting each other's roles and expertise under the premise that teamwork and collaborative care ultimately enhances the quality of treatment and care we provide to our patients. The code outlines the principles the board believes are essential, for effective shared care, communication, teamwork, patient-centred care, continuity of care, professional respect and trust, and documentation. Now, as oral health professionals, as I touched on at the beginning, we've all historically worked in a team environment and consequently generally intuitively adopt a collaborative approach to care. Being independent hasn't changed this. Well, I know it certainly hasn't for me. And it's also important to note that the code clearly states that working collaboratively does not alter a practitioner's personal accountability for their professional conduct or the care that they provide. Similarly, it stipulates the importance of delegation, referral, and handover.
So it's important to consider, if a patient's being seen by multiple practitioners, who's ultimately going to be managing this patient? So who's the most appropriate practitioner then to have an overarching view of the care?
That's right. Now, we don't bring this up to question only us as dental therapists, hygienists, OHTs. All practitioners, including dentists, make these assessments regularly. I'm trained and competent in restorative or root canal, extraction or orthodontics. But for this particular patient and in this particular situation, is it best treated by me or is it someone else? And there's also the consideration further to can I, but also should I?
Yeah, it's a very salient point. And this team approach really brings us a full circle to where we began earlier. We touched on the board's expectation that practitioners know their scope and highlights that practitioners must only perform dental treatments they've been educated and trained in and that they are competent in, with each individual being responsible for their own scope. So the question then, Kristin, is how do we assess our scope?
Yes, that's right. And the board is live to the potential for confusion here, which we've obviously seen today. And consequently, when these changes were being implemented to assist us in assessing our scope, the Dental Board also created some supporting resources, fact sheets and FAQs, as well as a reflective practice tool to assist us in reflecting on our knowledge, skills and abilities and consider how our overall competence relates to our areas of practice. I think we can all objectively look at this case and we stepped through today and see that at its core, it's really centred around a scope of practice issue, specifically not fully determining scope. And I wanted to take the time here to touch on a very important point within the scope of practice guidelines. We are responsible for assessing our own scope within our division based on our education, training and competencies, like we've said. And CPD also plays a role in this, with the benefits of CPD being to maintain and improve our skills and expertise, as well as broaden our scope of practice, though this can only be within our division. So the board is very clear that no amount of CPD will enable a practitioner to move from one division to another.
Indeed. So to be clear, regardless of Mrs. A's CPD in this situation, attending a line of courses and training in orthodontics treatment remained very clearly outside of the competencies and scope of an oral health professional.
Yes, that's entirely right. Now, I mentioned that the board developed the reflective tool to help practitioners determine their scope. And this may be a helpful tool not only for you as an individual, but also your team. If we are being mindful of managing our patients collaboratively, then this is an exercise that we can complete within our practice. So we all know where the boundaries and edges are for the other members of our team, whether that be different oral health professionals within the practice, dentists, or even our dental assistants, as some dentists have particular treatments they may or may not like to do, and maybe even your dental assistant can provide oral health education or radiography.
It's a lot to consider, Kristin, and it's a very comprehensive activity, one we should all be aware of and utilise. I'm sure you will have all picked up on another underlying necessity in all of this, when we are all working effectively together.
Yes, and this is one issue that comes up regularly, and that is communication. Communication really matters. We need to talk to each other. It's not just about how we communicate with our patients, it's also about how we communicate with our team. At the beginning, when we first started a practice, we need to consider, how do things work here? How do we check in regularly with each other? And how do we go about bringing up concerns? Essentially, look, if we can't talk with each other, how can we be expected to work cohesively as a team? And if we don't work as a team, it can ultimately be the patient who pays the price when all those holes line up and they fall through the cracks. So finally, our code of conduct and the scope of practice guidelines set out clear expectations for all dental practitioners. Providing comprehensive dental care in a shared model of care can be extremely rewarding. However, consideration must be given towards the issues that can arise if a clear, concise and coordinated plan is not established from the outset.
Yes, this can really be seen when we consider that historically, half of the complaints to the dental board are not actually based in treatment. And really, when you think about that, you can see just how important communication is. So just revisiting the main points today then, Kristin, we are all individuals whose experience, training and competencies vary significantly. And with our different experiences, locations and the unique teams we work in, independent practice is going to look very different and feel different for all of us.
Yes, that's right. And what doesn't change between us all, however, is our professional obligations and the expectation that we take the time to meaningfully consider and understand what is my scope, what is the scope of my colleagues and team. As practitioners working in a team, as part of a shared model of care, we need to continually ask ourselves, how do we work together here in this space, in this particular team, so that we can ensure that the patients remain central to what we do? How do we communicate effectively with each other so that we all know what's going on and understand what the plan is? What treatment needs to be provided, when, where, and by who? And we need to determine who's ultimately the driver, who's responsible for the treatment, and the plan for making sure that things stay on course.
We certainly do. Thanks so much, Kristin. These are some really important considerations that we all need to know, because ultimately we're all responsible for the treatment we provide, and we can't delegate these responsibilities. With independent practice comes autonomy, but further to this, with autonomy comes great responsibility. And it's important for the patients and for us that we give this the consideration it both warrants and deserves. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that you found this content helpful and relevant. And we really look forward to sharing more guidance with you in the future. If you like Dental Protection podcasts and you'd like to hear more, please subscribe and leave a review.